Thank you, Prime Minister Yatsenyuk and Danilo, for organizing this extraordinary conference and inviting me to speak. I wish I were there with you. I'm honored to give keynote closing remarks after a day of inspiring and fascinating discussions. It is remarkable that the Kyiv Security Forum has been able to pull all this together with participation around the globe amid Russia's brutal bombing campaign across Ukraine. As President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, I'm deeply proud of our Ukraine work ably led by Ambassador John Herbst. But it isn't just John Herbst. At the strength of our work, we have 16 programs and centers, and at any one time, 7, 8, 9 of them are working on Ukraine issues of one sort or another, whether it's on sanctions in the Geoeconomic Center, whether it's on working with our European allies in the Europe Center, in the Scowcroft Center, working across NATO, Digital Forensic Research Lab, working on issues of digital threats to democracy, and I could go on. In Washington, the Atlantic Council has been a clear and consistent voice, routinely reminding the world that Moscow began this conflict in 2014 and has been threatening the peace and security of Europe for well over a decade. In May, for the first time in our 60 history, we gave our highest award, the Atlantic Council's Distinguished Leadership Award, to an entire people, to the Ukrainian people, and not to an individual. And President Zelensky gave a very moving address in accepting that award. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 changed everything. Even though the conflict really began in 2014, February 24th changed everything. It's a geopolitical watershed moment, not just for Europe, not just for Ukraine, not just for NATO, but really for the world. Contrary to Putin's expectations, it has strengthened transatlantic ties and prompted Sweden and Finland to join a newly energized NATO. I'll be seeing the Swedish and Finnish foreign ministers in Washington next week. It has led to increased US-EU cooperation in imposing severe sanctions on Russia and the West to provide military and economic support to Ukraine. Ukraine must succeed in pushing back Putin, and Putin must fail. Ukraine must win, and Putin must lose. His failures on the battlefield, increasing erosion of his international standing, provide an opportunity for us to do the right thing. We have to accelerate our efforts to ensure Putin's defeat and Ukraine's victory. This year has been an inflection point, not just for Ukraine, but the entire international liberal order. The US and NATO allies must see that in supporting Ukraine, they have the opportunity to directly defend the values of the rules-based system we have forged together and which really spawned the Atlantic Council in the first place. Ukrainian resilience, resourcefulness, patriotism, and bravery have provided the free world an opportunity not only to help Ukraine, but to recommit, and that's so important, recommit to our own values. At the Atlantic Council, we know that much of what happens on the front line will be influenced by decisions here in Washington. And that's why we have stressed in our work the core American interests in a sovereign, free, independent, and democratic Ukraine. In this effort, we work with many partners, especially in Ukraine, and we make sure that Ukrainian voices are heard through our programming and publications every day. Now, many question how long Washington's strong support can continue. I have a simple answer, and one that Joe Biden never tires of saying, and he says, write this down as long as it takes. But it doesn't just happen. It happens through the work of all of you in Ukraine. It happens through the work of your friends here in Washington to keep the support flowing. And for better or worse, President Putin continues to encourage people like us in the horrors that he rains down on Ukraine every day. The results of our midterm elections in the United States also confirm our deep support for your cause. The most ardent voices of support against support for Ukraine failed at the ballot box. They won't go away. We're a democracy. There's always going to be different points of view. But bipartisan support for Ukraine remains firm, And if our bipartisan organization, the Atlantic Council, is feeling this on both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans. And we will continue to explain why Ukraine matters to American national security. Now, let me turn to the most important subject. Weapons, weapons, and weapons. I wish it were not so. We continually emphasize at the Atlantic Council the need for strong Western support for Ukraine. The Atlantic Council has been at the forefront of the weapons debate, going back to the question of javelins in 2015. We've always been in favor of stronger defensive weapons for Ukraine from that period of time to now. The Biden administration has been responsive, supplying much needed military supplies like the vaunted HIMARS rocket systems, critical budget support to the tune of $8.5 billion for Ukraine. A critical new package of support is making its way through Congress now, again, underscoring the extent of U.S. bipartisan support for Ukraine. We cannot err on doing too little. That would be the biggest mistake of all right now. The European Union has remained unified with the United States and others behind an unprecedented set of sanctions on Russia. Further, it has begun to strengthen its hard power through increased defense spending, and it has moved swiftly to reduce its shameful energy dependence on Moscow. In ways Putin never envisioned when he launched his war, the EU has committed itself to ensuring Ukraine's future as a democratic, independent, and European country through billions of euros of economic support, unprecedented arms deliveries, and an offer of membership candidacy to Ukraine and Moldova. There's so much room to make Western support for Ukraine even stronger, and we will be your friends in pushing for that. We know that Congress and the administration could do more and could act more quickly. And now is the time, as Ukraine faces a cold and dark winter and one of the most dangerous in its 31 years of independence. For all the impressive arms shipments and economic support the Biden administration has delivered, we have to do more. We have given you weapons that fire only 50 miles. Moscow continues to indiscriminately kill civilians. This is not a winning formula. My own view is if somebody's bombing my house and I can only shoot within the fence of my house, is that really getting the job done? My own point of view. A greater quantity of more advanced weaponry should be made available to help Ukraine defend itself against Russian aggression. And let me say it as plainly as possible. If you want peace in Ukraine, send weapons now. Ukraine needs to make as much progress on the battlefield in order to extract a just, lasting, and durable peace. That's the way to be a peacemaker. Today, to counter their failures on the battlefield, Russia has increased targeting on civilian energy and heating infrastructure through cowardly missile, drone, and artillery strikes ahead of winter. Ukraine desperately needs not only advanced anti-air defenses to protect its people, but also additional budgetary and infrastructure support to ensure Ukrainians survive the winter. It's easy to say yes to this when you know the issue is not about Ukraine alone. It really is about us all across the world who believe in freedom, independence, and democracy. The bottom line is that unanticipated Ukrainian resilience, resourcefulness, patriotism, and bravery have provided the free world an opportunity not only to aid Ukraine, but also to reverse years of democratic drift and authoritarian resurgence and demonstrate that our reality matches our rhetoric. We have had a relative decline in democracy across the world since 2006, 2007, and it's time to reverse that. To stay the course, Western leaders and citizens must understand what they're doing is not just for Ukraine, but even more for themselves. The lessons we learned from 2 devastating world wars and a Cold War are that unity is a prerequisite for victory and that appeasing despots never works. We do not need to provide Putin a diplomatic off-ramp. He can leave Ukraine whenever he wants. We need to make sure that he understands that his aggression in Ukraine will fail. To help him understand this faster, we need tougher sanctions and a more effective Ukrainian counteroffensive backed by longer range weapons. Then the diplomats can go to work. Then they can go to work negotiating a just peace. The Atlantic Council is committed to making that message clear in Washington well beyond, while also at the same time respecting the Biden administration for how far it's gone and respecting the US and EU support as historic in nature, while at the same time recognizing that more should be done and must be done. The future of the global system, as we would want it to operate, depends on Ukraine's victory and survival as a democratic, independent, free democratic state. And so now is the time to act. Now is the time for unity in the face of Putin's threats. Now is the time for the West to redouble support for Ukraine and ensure that Ukraine has the tools necessary to win. We are with you, Ukraine. Slava Ukraini. Thank you so much for your attention.